started. Welcome to the next installment of the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative's monthly, or sometimes more often and sometimes further span, our monthly Distinguished Fellow Seminars. We're excited to bring to you today Karla Phillips from ExcelinEd. I'll talk a little bit about her and what she'll bring, but first I'd like to just give some broad brush comments about how we'll make this happen today. For the format is more or less us doing some throat clearing, getting organized. Then we're going to hand the proposal tools to Karla for her to run through her presentation. After that, we will then solicit some feedback and some comments using the chat function. You'll see that in the bottom right-hand portion of your screen there. Make sure that you select everyone when you are sending a chat function or sending a chat. We'll then see that and we'll curate those as we go along. I may ask our distinguished fellows who are on the call to weigh in a few spots if pertinent, where their expertise makes sense. And then we'll conclude, give Karla a chance to conclude some remarks, and that will finish up the seminar. That's how it'll go today. I want to offer just a couple of remarks here about the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative and how we see this work here. We at the Research Collaborative are really committed to catalyzing and communicating the research that is in the field for stakeholder audiences, which include parents and kids and families and building level leaders and system level leaders and those who are in the workforce who are interested in getting these kinds of graduates from our local schools that are well prepared for college, career, and civic readiness. And one of the key things that we see, one of the key roles that we think we play is to help translate key findings from research to make sure that the uptake for them in the field is more readily facilitated. And one thing that we know is that the field is quite noisy and quite complicated. And that's the reason why we asked Karla to give this presentation today. They've been doing some fantastic work at figuring out how some of the key terms in student-centered learning, among them personalized learning, are being understood and misunderstood, how they're being used and misused, and how the public is receptive to certain messages and others, and where there might be some confusion that we can sink into and try to change. So Karla and her team have done fantastic work in teeing this up for us and will help us to understand how subsequent research, new implementation strategies, and better messaging can help meet the public where they're at. And we're really excited to bring her on today. With that, I'll introduce her. Karla is the Policy Director for Personalized Learning at ExcelinEd. Previously, she served as the Special Assistant to the Deputy Superintendent of Policy and Programs at the Arizona Department of Education. She also served as the Education Policy Advisor to Governor Brewer as the Vice Chair of Arizona's Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. Her experience includes serving as the Director of State Government Relations for Arizona State University and as a Senior Policy Advisor for Arizona's House of Representatives. She received her BA from Indiana University, IU, and an MPA from Arizona State University. So we're delighted to have her here, and with that, I will hand the presentation tools to Karla. Karla, welcome and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm hoping that you all received the email from Melanie that had the full deck of the findings. I know all of you are researchers at heart, so you'll probably want to dig deeper into the questions and the actual data. And if that is not, if you want even more, please feel free to reach out to me after and we can get you even more in-depth detail. So I want to tell you what the impetus of this project really was, is we saw some really big shifts happening nationally. And first of all, it was the shift in terminology. We saw more and more space in schools moving away from the term of competency-based education to the broader term of personalized learning. And I'm sure I don't have to tell all of you that we also noticed a significant increase in interest in implementation at all levels. And so the reason we have been advocating for innovation in pilot programs was so that we can learn lessons, primarily policy lessons. But quite frankly, the biggest takeaway and our biggest lesson really quickly continues to be how critical it is to communicate and have strategic outreach to all levels of policymakers and stakeholders across the state in order for these initiatives to really take hold and succeed. So because of that, we did two things. We contracted with a company. We did a digital landscape analysis. So we searched the internet, all of the social media networks, to find out how all these terms were playing. And then we did some specific message testing to 800 voters nationally that we'll talk about in a second. One of the things that I do want to touch on before we go really deep is when we approached this project, it was with the goal of kind of having that one-pager or your elevator pitch. So for me, it is that one-pager that goes to policymakers, but really that introductory, what I might even call it the opening salvo, the introduction to this initiative to either policymakers or school-level folks. This is not the language you're going to use in an in-depth three-day professional development training with teachers or who are already on board. So we started, I think, as most of these types of projects do, with kind of the general questions at the front of, do you think students who graduate today with a diploma and good enough grades are ready to succeed? And I want to tell you that we specifically and strategically inserted that good enough grades to really get at that piece of mastery and competency. And the findings are not all that different than we've seen in everything nationally. Yes, most, and maybe yes, some, 56. But I got to tell you, as I've reflected on that over time, it's really striking to me that only 18% think that only most students who graduate with a diploma and good enough grades are ready. So I think I'm probably guilty of the fact that I've even glossed over that data point quite a few times and just recently really had time to reflect on that and how important that is. And then we asked the big question if they think that we need to think differently about how school works. I was surprised that the number was that high. So yes said 87%. But we decided to probe based on findings that we had from a partner that did some focus groups. And we did a split sample survey, and we asked half the voters if they think schools in America are inadequate and therefore we need to rethink about them, or if they think schools in America are outdated. So it was a split sample. And you can see there was a pretty big disparate change in terms of how many strongly felt they were outdated versus inadequate. And this is really important because especially the personalized learning advocate community, which I consider myself a member of, typically our pitches have been, I always joke we have that slide of the 18th century classroom with the iPad superimposed on it, and truly trying to make this case of being outdated, but inadequate is the message that resonates. But if you think about it, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, that makes sense. People know that the world is changing at a rapid pace, the employment survey and landscape is changing, and that our students need to be adequately prepared for that future. So we just generally found out, and this is probably not surprising, but it was also reaffirming, that the term personalized learning was generally well received but not really well known. But there was one significant gap that I'll point out, and I only point out demographic changes when they were significant, and this was the biggest one. So 68% of Hispanic voters and 59% of those with only a high school diploma had not heard of it. So that's a pretty big difference when you're thinking about what community you're going to be messaging to. But probably the best news for us is that the term appears to be intuitive. So we asked the open-ended question of what they thought it was. We got over 400 open-ended responses, so I'm happy to share if you want to research. But you'd see there's just the common theme is the verb they used. It was catered, it's tailored, it's adjusted, it's customized. So they generally get this idea of what it means to be personalized. But then we tested a very specific definition. We tested the definition of students advancing to higher levels of learning when they personally demonstrate mastery of key concepts and skills. Now, if you read that, you really, those of you, and you guys know this, that's really the definition of competency-based education, but we did that intentionally as well, believing that most of personalized learning is intuitive and very friendly, user-friendly. Who's going to disagree with meeting students' needs? But this piece, that mastery-based progression, we think is the most difficult one to understand as well as implement and evaluate, quite frankly. So we specifically asked this question, and I'm not going to lie, I was shocked at how well this tested. So if you look at, 80% still thought it was a good idea. So that was a very pleasant surprising, but surprising indeed. But then we said, okay, after you've heard that definition, what questions do you have? And this is what we tell people, even after you've develop the most perfect elevator pitch. You've got support, the pilot program is going to work, be ready because this is going to happen. And everybody who's done this work, and if you've been out in the field and you've done presentations, you know these are the questions we get, right? What does this look like? What does it mean? How does a teacher do that? So that's really the next issue that we all need to address and be ready to. Then we did the specific message testing. So we had a series of 9 statements that we felt described the benefits of personalized learning, most of which you've seen in all the work across the country, and we asked them if it made them more or less interested in the schools in their area implementing personalized learning. Much more, somewhat more, neither more or less, somewhat less, much less. But this is where it got interesting. We asked them to click on the words or phrases that stood out to them as particularly important as to why it made them more or less interested. So generally speaking, all 9 statements tested really well. Generally, 65 to 76% of folks were more interested. But that's when they got to choose the words, and that's when you're going to see some really distinct differences. But before we look at that, I want to point out they were able to choose more than one word. But in most questions, there were clearly words that sparked interest or disinterest, quite frankly, and got their attention. But our theory was that based on the responses to those open-ended questions that we got on this and we all get every day, it may be that some words prompted even more questions or concerns and indicates the difficulty of how hard it is to understand rather than really making them more or less interested. Because there were a lot of key concepts that we'll talk about in a second that made people more and less interested. In other words, they shared commonality. So we think those are the ones that people just, they saw those words and go, what does that mean? I don't get it. And you'll see them when you see the data slide deck that we distributed, you'll see the exact data hits for each word in all 9 sentences. But generally, the words that tested well were mastery. And that's an important one. Again, we did a split sample and we asked half the voters if they thought completion, I'll try to see if I memorize the question, if completing a course like algebra indicated mastery and then asked half of them competency, enough to move on to the next course or key concept. Overwhelmingly, voters felt more confident with the word mastery. That was a really big finding for us, and quite frankly, we adjusted a lot of our internal and external documentation based on that. So we're talking more about mastery-based progressions than competency-based education now. Inadequate tested really well, but again, it's because we believe it's because parents know that they need to be adequately prepared. But probably the 2 biggest phrases that tested the highest were strengths and interests and knowledge and skills. So I always joke with folks, you can't use the term knowledge and skills enough from what we could tell. It didn't matter if we talked about it that they had to be prepared with them, they had to demonstrate them, or they needed them to succeed. That phrase resonated really strongly. And so did flexibility and engagement. And again, I always try to keep my mom hat on sometimes because as an education reformer, we're a unique subset of people. But moms and dads, we have a lot more commonality with these voters, right? So engagement, especially when you hit those middle school, high school years, we're all worried about our students staying engaged. So we had some words that I used as yellow. Now, I'll be frank with you, when we were kind of developing these summaries, these were words I was really going to put in the red. Because what we did was we found 5 sentences that were, and this is hard to say because it's a negative, a double negative, that were the most successful negative messages that we found on the internet that opponents of personalized learning and CBE were using and seemed to resonate well. So we asked those voters those same 5 questions and asked them to click on those words that made them so much less interested, and these were some of them. Standardized testing is a perfect example. Less interaction with teachers and peers. It could cost too much. Teachers will be overworked. Lower expectations. Now, the reason I chose to put these in yellow and not red is because as I thought about it, I don't think anybody would be foolish enough to advertise personalized learning as increasing standardized testing, right? But I think we have to have caution because I think oftentimes we may message it in such a way that leads people to think that. If we use innocuous phrases or seemingly innocuous phrases like, students will be frequently assessed to determine mastery for progression to the next concept, that kind of thing, some people are going to read that and just hear more testing. Because we know the average voter isn't going to distinguish between summative and formative and benchmark and all that other stuff that we like to talk about. They just may hear more testing. Same with cost too much, depending on how much you emphasize the technology piece or the changes that's going to happen in the school can lead them very easily to think it's going to cost too much and the teachers will be overworked. And lower expectations, I think, is the one that we all can fall the easiest into, the trap that we may all fall the easiest into. This concept is so hard for the average voter to understand because none of us, quite frankly, experience it unless we happen to go to maybe to a Montessori school when we were young, or our kids do. So the only way they may think that it's possible to get every student truly to mastery or even proficiency would be to lower the bar. So even though they may not say it, the way we message it can very easily make folks think that that's the only way it could possibly happen. So that's why I put these words under caution. Some of the red words, seat time. Seat time tested so extremely poorly. which again, as I reflected on it, it was like, well, duh, it's pretty wonky. And there's ways to talk about the time students spend in the classroom versus using a term like seat time. So that was an easy one to kind of adjust or get rid of. But there was a couple sentences we had that said schools may change classroom design, school schedule, attendance, participation, extra credit. We had 2 sentences that focused on that. Those words tested very poorly and got a lot of negative response. But again, as I've had time to reflect on it, it shouldn't be that surprising because we know one thing we know for sure is nobody likes change, right? That word change didn't even test very well. But we're really telling them that everything they know about school now, those kind of iconic parts of traditional school, are going to change. You know, again, upon reflection, that was not a very wise strategy for me. I literally deleted these sentences from all my one-pagers. So if I'm going to give a one-pager to a policymaker, kind of a sales pitch, why am I going to tell them that everything they know about school right now is going to change immediately? Especially we know from the folks that are actually doing this work in the field, these are not going to change in the first year at all. They may change years into implementation, but again, thinking about an elevator pitch or a one-pager, we don't want to freak people out, for lack of a more professional term. Well, things that may not even happen for a couple years. And there are some schools that haven't even gotten there yet that I've toured and met with that are 2 or 3 years in and haven't even gotten to this folk yet. So we really put these as red flags because we don't want to scare people that everything they know about school is going to change at the outset. So I want to tell you, based on these results, this is how we're now messaging personalized learning. And I say very frequently and very publicly, I'm sometimes evolving this, it seems like, on a daily basis. A couple things I want to point out to you is you'll see that the way we're trying to show it is that mastery-based education is really the foundation for personalized learning. Because we do believe that having a system of mastery-based progression is the key to ensuring equity and rigor for all kids. As we're personalizing and opening flexibility for students over here, we still have to make sure that the bar stays the same for everyone. One sentence I want to point out in particular, though, is the last sentence in the first bullet point. Students are encouraged to play a greater role and be more invested in their learning. I see very often colleagues really emphasizing student voice and choice, which I think is a very inside baseball term, and most people don't know what it means. And we've seen from our testing that the term play have a greater input in their learning didn't test very well. And I've seen similar results in other partner studies. And I think that there's danger in how we message personalized learning as the outcomes versus the requirements. So if we message personalized learning as owning their own learning, that's a very common term. Students will own their own learning. We can be inadvertently telling folks that they need to have a certain skill set in order to even participate or be in personalized learning, rather than messaging it as an outcome, as an intentional outcome of personalized learning, right? And because we also know that some of the most frequently asked questions, and the Alliance for Excellent Education found this really strongly in their work, was that people had concerns that this is not for all kids. This is for the gifted, it's for the students who are mature enough to handle it. So I really urge a lot of caution. So that sentence is, quite frankly, my way of trying to get at this idea of increased student voice choice without, one, using those terms, but not using too strong of language of having ownership over their own learning. Because as I've often been known to joke publicly, I'm not sure why I would want my son to do that, because at home he doesn't have that ownership. Or as I often joke, this is, my kid who can't remember his lunchbox, his homework and stuff. So parents can easily think there's no way my child could be successful in that because they can't do that now, rather than really making sure we're messaging it as the goal of personalized learning is to develop those skills and have students graduate being able to make those kinds of decisions. So again, these are some of the things that we saw in the Alliance for Excellent Education. When they asked some open-ended questions, these were the feedback that they got. It may be too unrealistic, because how do you really get all children to proficiency? We got to make sure we're focusing on the fundamentals. So if they hear a lot of the social emotional language type here, some folks had concerns that we may lose sight of the fundamentals. But the two that really worry me are the only for gifted and the student maturity, because quite frankly, I do hear those often, and I hear them at the school level. too experimental. And I'll be honest with you, we're even pulling away a little bit from the term pilot and talking about networks more, so it doesn't sound like we're just experimenting on kids. The too reliant on technology is not a surpriser to, I'm sure, any of you on the phone. We all know that that's a concern. There's been actually a recent spate of articles expressing concern that all personalized learning is putting kids in front of computers all day, which we know is not true, but that's a kind of pernicious myth that keeps rearing its ugly head. So our advice is, of course, to be thoughtful and be intentional, especially being responsive to your local community. So the technology piece is a really important example of being intentional. You know, we have pilot schools that are in very rural and remote areas. So that use of technology is going to look dramatically different in a school like that than in a downtown high school setting. So really being sure the local policymakers and school leaders being intentional about how they message it to meet the needs of their community, and not just kind of a stock definition from even an organization like ours. And here we have some resources, and I'm also really excited to announce that I've been co-writing a communications guide to make this data operational for school leaders that should be out in the next 2 weeks. And I will make sure that Melanie and Eric get copies of that so we can distribute it to everyone. Do we have questions?
Fantastic, Karla. Yes, there are some great questions. So I'm just going to start going through them because they're all fantastic. The first one is, I think, a clarifying about the methodology here. It's from Wendy Sir, who's one of the leads on one of our many research teams as part of the research collaborative. And she's asking for you to clarify whether the terms that you were citing there with the green light, red light, orange, or yellow light were ones that you tested, or whether those were terms that respondents raised in response to phrases. There was a confusion there.
Oh, thank you for asking that. They were words that got clicked on. Those were words that voters actually clicked on in what I call the red words. So when you see my data, if you see that long data set, you'll see each sentence, and you'll see the words and how many people, the percent clicked on it. And if they were positive, it made them more interested. We rated them green. If they clicked on them and made them less interested, they were red. So those are specific words that were in the actual sentences.
Great, thank you. The next question is from our Associate Vice President at JFF, Rebecca Wolf, who has been leading a lot of these definitional efforts in Students at the Center and the Students at the Center project, and is a chief architect of the research collaborative and helped build that out. And she's asking questions that help get right to it here. So the mastery versus competency proficiency terms, it's really important for us to be thinking about whether we should be leading with one versus the other and how we use that. We've been using competency because that was what was originally codified in federal regulations and many different spots in the field when it was younger. Do you think that's something worth trying to change with policymakers? In other words, getting the policy and policymakers at the state or the federal level to use mastery more? What's your perspective there?
That's a fantastic question, and we get it very often because we helped sponsor and advocate legislation that created competency-based pilots prior to this. So what I have been telling states and, quite frankly, our advocacy directors is I wouldn't aggressively pursue name changes because we all know what happens when you pursue legislative changes. Other things can happen. If the opportunity is there, you know, we're happy to help in that effort. But right now, we're respectful of whatever term is already in statute in terms of helping support states. But we think when State Department folks are creating their websites or their pamphlets, or when school leaders are explaining this, they can certainly emphasize mastery over competency, even though it's still in statute.
Helpful. So keep the terms alive, but really do think about messaging when you go with more finalized materials that you're hitting to with broader audiences.
Yeah, and it may make sense to do it in a bigger bill, which is what we tried to do in Florida because we were going to address some other policy issues. We proposed changing that word as well. Politically, I probably would never advise doing it just for that purpose unless you were going to do other things in that statute.
Got it, got it. Thank you. Next question is just about the term that we use, which is student-centered learning, the broad brush, or the broad umbrella term to encompass personalization, ownership, competency-based forms of education, and what we call anytime, anywhere, which is really building the learning opportunities far beyond the school day. How did that test, if at all? How are you hearing folks respond to that term, student-centered learning?
We didn't specifically test that term. So what I'm about to say is my personal opinion, but again, actually having looked at all the open-ended responses and stuff, I think that term is intuitive, because all of their responses to what they think personalized learning is centered on the student, centered on the learning being tailored, customized, personalized, whatever verb they used on the student. So I think that is intuitive. And that's really what we were trying to get at. And honestly, if I think about mastery versus competency, even mastery is just a little bit more intuitive to a non-educator than competency is.
Great. A question from Charlie Tillman, who heads up the policy shop at the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. He has a question. Was the shift from competency-based education to personalized learning based on testing with the public and others, or did leading organizations just decide to make that shift on their own? Do you know? Do you have any background there?
No, and I certainly can't speak for all the other organizations. We just noted the distinct shift, and we were already in the process of making that as well. So that's part of what this was intended to inform, was our shift to a broader term than just competency-based. But for us, policy-wise, emphasizing that the definition include mastery-based progressions is still a critical piece for us. Yeah.
There's another question I want to ask, and this is linking two things that you had there. There's the recognition that many folks understand some of the key terms and some of the policies and procedures and practices that are underneath them as being solely reserved for the gifted and talented sorts, the kids that want to learn and all of that completely ridiculous problematic language. But they're responding to, you know, some of the way that those things have been moved toward those populations historically, and the way that schools have structured themselves in order to give those privileged access to the privileged students. And then also the finding that some of your marginalized populations, racially, ethnically, socioeconomically, linguistically, some of the families did not seem to have any familiarity with those terms. Both of those strike me as a field problem, that we're not getting information both to those who are in the system and those who are outside of the system in a way that makes it clear that this is for everyone. Did you find other findings that relate to that that would give us some pause and help us to direct some efforts?
I did. Thank you for that great question. I have to say at the outset, summarizing our findings into these short slide decks has probably been my biggest dilemma. Because again, we're happy to make that data available to anybody, because you'll see how rich and robust it was. But one of the things that I didn't have in that slide deck is, although they had less familiarity with that term, after going through the experience of the survey at the end, they had higher levels of interest, which is very exciting.
Great.
So that was probably a really great finding there. And I totally agree with you. I think a lot of gifted programs have been messaged in exactly that way, right, in terms of empowering those skills. But I do think that there's that we all need to have pause. We're messaging it, I believe, as an intended outcome and an expected outcome. Because I always try to keep my parent hat. I think every parent wants their student to graduate with those skills and being able to own those things. But most parents don't think their kids are ready for it now, regardless of how old they are. So I think it's very subtle, but I think it's critical.
Another question from one of our distinguished fellows, Kim Carter. She has an observation that leads to a question here. And what you found as a response to the student choice and voice aligns with the response that she gets frequently from educators who are grappling with what personalized learning means and what it looks like in practice. In other words, they sort of interpret that to mean that students who need to bring a particular set of skills rather than receive a different set of developmental opportunities that give them those skills. So I do wonder how much that is due to a lack of clarity, potentially in the terms, specificity about what those skills are and how they relate to academic learning. Can you comment on that dynamic at all? You might be on mute there.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I have contractors at the house, so if you hear a little hammering every now and then, you'll know why I'm on mute.
Not a problem.
I think, because we're all struggling with the definition. I participated in someone else's survey just recently yesterday on how to define this. And I think we've been trying, and we being kind of the global, all of us, personalized learning advocates, we have been struggling with how to define it, and those definitions end up sounding like a checklist of things that personalized learning programs have to include, rather than messaging it as what the goals and outcomes and how we want to change the experience for students and how we want them to graduate differently than they are now. So I think if we did it that way, if we focused more on those outcomes and goals, we would gain more interest and support in the long run as well as in the short run. and we wouldn't have these myths keep creeping up that it's not for all kids. Because if we make it sound like these are the things, and I call it the checklist definition, because we've all experienced this at school. Sometimes think, okay, yeah, I'm doing these 3 things. I must be personalized learning. Well, it's not a checklist, right? It's a culture. It's a mind. I'm preaching to the choir with you guys. But again, I think it's subtle. I don't think anybody's intentionally even doing these things, but I think unknowingly or unwittingly, we are all doing it quite often.
Yeah. That's a subtle but super important point of just about the way that we talk about this, the hopes that we attach to it, the way we communicate to various audiences. Really helpful to think about continuing to keep the focus that this is for all kids in all contexts. This is not meant to be some and not others. It's great to keep reinforcing that. A question from Craig Kesselheim, what are the best ways to convey the urgency and potential of equity that is embedded in personalized learning? Do you know some particular tweaks or messaging that was found to be receptive by the audiences that you polled?
Clearly, knowledge and skills was the strongest message, and adequately preparing. So my favorite phrase now is that we want students to be adequately prepared with the knowledge and skills they need to succeed for their future. That's my favorite phrase now. The other term that resonated really well, and this is really kind of geared especially to policymakers too, is flexibility. So it's providing schools, so the policymakers need to provide school flexibility, schools need to provide educators flexibility, educators need to provide students flexibility. People like that idea because we've seen in another study a partner of ours did, some focus groups, that one of the terms that resonated really strongly with parents was one size fits all. That nobody wants a cookie cutter house, so because every parent knows that their kids are different. So taking that and messaging it, it's not a one size fits all. It's about providing flexibility for your students. Those are really positive messages.
Yeah, I concur, and that resonates with what we found in the research collaborative with 2 projects that we support that are investigating agency, and this is really no surprise to anyone who works with other people regularly, but that we tend to respond, all learners, whether you're an adult learner, whether you're a child learner, adolescent learner, whether it's in school, out of school, whatever the learning situation is, we tend to respond with our best selves and with our most intellectual resources available to us when we feel like we have a choice in what we're doing and we have some agency and some ownership over and some decisions and interests that are driven internally that are being expressed externally. And so flexible learning systems tend to work really well, not just for kids, but they tend to work really well for the teachers who are in charge of implementing those flexible systems. So the fact that we're seeing that word flexibility focus really well across different political contexts is a great way for us to think about how to message agency and ownership. I think that's really helpful.
So again, I want to stress that we were developing these questions and ideas really intended for the one-pager, or as I often say, that opening salvo, when you're really just trying to explain to someone what it is, which is something we all frequently have to do often. So I want to go back on that voice, choice, agency, all of those terms that we use. I think that focusing on those outcomes of increased engagement, because engagement also tested really well. I think focusing on those are the things we're doing to increase their engagement, increase their success, the goals, messaging those goals, rather than making it sound like they need to have those skills now, because voice, choice, and agency really are skills. I mean, if you have a kid, you know that they don't really have them, they're not born with them, we have to develop them. And so again, it can lead right into the, well, my kid's not ready to do that now. They're not, you know, he can't even remember his homework now, and and he gets told to do it. So we're really messaging it as the outcome because they do want their students to have those skills when they graduate.
Right, yeah. So that relates to this question just about how to frame agency. A lot of, agentic experiences, to use a really academic term, but a lot of those ownership-based experiences that can happen in classrooms or with teachers in the way that they implement this have to do with whether they're given opportunities for that. And Kim asks again, did language related to opportunity or opportunity gaps come up at all in what people were saying were the key terms for them or the things that you tested?
I'm looking at my data as we're talking. No, we did not specifically test the term opportunity. I can tell you that definitively. No, but I think you just hit on a key point. I think there's a difference between, and I will admit some of these are my own opinions based on our data and what I've seen from numerous other studies, including Nellie Mae's. I think positioning this as an opportunity to increase those types of experience is different than saying they're going to have them. So you got to think from a parent perspective, it's summer, you just get this flyer, you hear about this new program at your school, and you think they're going to sit down on day one and be able to do those things. See what I'm saying? There's a difference. Where you want to say, we want to increase the opportunities for your students to have a little bit more input, be engaged, that's exciting. But if it sounds like on day one, they're going to have to be able to determine what they want to do at their own pace, that's kind of daunting. So again, subtle, but I think critical.
And you're referencing, that's a couple times now you've talked about this one-pager. And can you tell me a little bit more about your vision there? You're thinking about the way that schools and districts communicate with their parents, families, and kids about this, that they really need to be very careful about these and use the right words and not use the wrong ones. Is that your vision for this next step?
Absolutely. So we're getting ready to release the communications guide with Ed Elements, and that one is geared specifically at educators. We are hoping to use that as a template to do one that's more geared to the broader public and policymakers. So one pagers is kind of policy language. It's, you know, what lobbyists and staffers give the legislators. Here's your one pager on personalized learning, what you need to know. But from an educator perspective, it really is about, you know, that first school board meeting, that first PTO meeting, what you're going to put in the school newsletter at first year. So how are you going to message this to gain support? Because we also know that this is a long-term endeavor. This is not something you implement in 1 year and then you move on to the next thing. So it's really critical that you build that support all along the way, and it's got to be in for the long term. So that's why, again, I think it's so important to build support for the vision and the outcomes that you want for students to change rather than what it's going to look like in the daily class experience. And it's hard to push back because as we saw from those open-ended questions, those are the immediate questions that people have. What is the classroom going to look like? But I think especially at the outset, it's important to really get buy-in to the long-term vision.
Yeah, and along those same lines, you know, in this day and age, in order to communicate and get your message heard across multiple audiences, you know, we can't afford to ignore social media anymore. I'm wondering to what extent the terms that you've used here and how you've tested them translate into hashtags and, you know, retweets and social media, and whether there's still further tweaking that needs to be done for those platforms or whether it's just an easy cut and paste.
Well, and I think, again, it depends on the intended audience. I mean, I think most of the Twitter and social network, it's for us in the choir to get each other excited, like, oh, I was just at this really great school and they have great student agency, voice of choice or whatever. But if I'm a principal or superintendent or a teacher and my followers, and this is what the hashtag is for, or the hashtag is for my school, I think it's a very different message strategy.
Great, thank you. I've got a great question from Michelle Pulick, one of our distinguished fellows. She's a district official in Hartford, Connecticut, and has been leading a whole lot of really important efforts there. She asks, I'm curious about the anywhere, anytime aspect of student-centered learning. Again, that's let's not restrict our learning to the school day. Let's think about everything from work-based learning to workplace learning to place-based learning, blended learning, summer learning, summer melt, all of that. Do you see that concept embedded in a new definition of personalized learning, that anytime, anywhere is sort of part of that and subsumed within that? And if so, did you test any language related to learning in and outside of the classroom?
I'm going through the data in my mind, that's why I'm kind of looking up. Not specifically. I would say the piece that probably got at it were those, unfortunately, was those words that were in red, the things that potentially might change. School calendars, schedules, all of that stuff. I don't think, again, in your first year of outreach to your parents, I don't think those are the things. You don't want to focus on everything that's going to change in the traditional school experience right now, because one, it's not going to happen in the first year or two. I mean, I doubt it. I don't know of any school that's been able to do it in that first year or two. Again, getting their buy-in to those, how different are the graduates going to look? What skills, what knowledge and skills will they have that's different? How much more will they be empowered when they leave, rather than the microscopic changes that are going to happen in the classroom, because you can get significant pushback fast.
Great. Another question from Wendy Sir, one of our leads in the research teams. Are there any alternatives to the word change that you would suggest we use when referring to the attentions of schools that are engaged in this work? Yeah, that's a great question. I would love to know the answer to that one.
I would say not use it. I would say try not to ever use it.
Really?
Nobody
You'd
likes
say it
change.
that clearly?
Nobody likes change. Nobody likes it. But you can talk about how This initiative endeavors to ensure that students are adequately prepared with the knowledge, focusing on the goal and the outcome and how that's going to get them there. So really getting that long-term buy-in. Because if not, then what is the purpose of changing the schedule? And I'm not kidding, this just happened 2 days ago. I've said this very publicly as a joke, that if you ever, talk to a school board member, if you ever want to find out what it takes to get parents outraged at a school board meeting, propose any change to the bus schedule, the lunch schedule, the summer schedule. Okay, now I'm not kidding, this is true 2 days ago, and I live in a state where we have 600 independent LEA charters and almost 300 school districts. So there's a lot. It was like the top of the 10 o'clock news was because one of the school districts proposed a change to the calendar. I'm not kidding, and how many parents flooded. So I'm not just saying this, it's true. I mean, those are things that just get parents out in droves, and especially when it's not going to happen at the outset. At the outset, the hardest part I think you have in this first year, that's why we tested those questions, how do you make the case for change? Your school, like, the Lindsay story, Lindsay Unified, they had schools that were underperforming, whatever term they use in California, failing, whatever. So it was a different case. But if you're in a school or district that's traditionally a high performer or even just a good performer, you really got to think about how you're going to make the case for change. So one of the things when I do longer presentations for educators and have specific takeaway exercises we do, I have real live articles from the past couple months of things that are happening, and one of them was out in the Northeast. I want to say it was Connecticut, but don't quote me on that. A school that was using Summit. The parents got outraged and shut the program down, and part of it was, why do we have to change? We were already a great school district. All of our kids were going to college. Why do we have to change? So, and there's a quote in there from the principal who says, yeah, it was probably too much too fast. So that's what I'm getting at with the focusing on what's going to change in class. You're going to get to that too much too fast, rather than really trying to help them understand why things need to evolve.
It reminds me of the oft-repeated maxim that people often don't fear change. What they fear is loss, and to pay attention to what it is that they're scared of losing, and then the change can often seem like less daunting. And just a side note here, recommend it to folks that as a Hewlett grantee, we all attended the Billions Institute in San Diego a while back, where Dan Heath came to speak about his book Switch, and Switch speaks directly to many of the things that you're speaking about, which is we have to think very clearly about our messaging, but so often we're thinking so intellectually, so cerebrally about our messaging that if we're just logical and rational, people will want to do that. Well, we're human beings with a lot of emotional attachments to our routines and what makes us feel safe, and warm, fuzzy things, and we're scared of cold, prickly things, and we really have to pay attention to the stuff that people are afraid of and how we message, and the stuff that most messes with them sometimes is you tweak the bus schedule, your plan's dead before it even starts. Like, don't go with bus schedule first, you're going to lose.
Okay, so here's my confession. Here's a sentence that I used to use all the time that I could kick myself for, because I've been struggling really hard with trying to make the case for mastery-based progressions or proficiency-based system. So trying to figure out how, the dilemma there is how to convince people that the current system is sending what I like to call false signals and mixed messages by giving credits and diplomas based on seat time and grades.
Right.
But how do I message that without freaking people out? So I used to use the sentence that this new system will be based on actual and not extra credit, homework, and participation. I thought that was a winning message. First of all of those words tested off the charts red. But then I thought about it, I'm like, don't we, every single one of us on the phone probably has an anecdotal story of how the only reason we passed or got an A or got whatever we did is because we did extra credit, or we did those things. Okay, so why is that so spicy? I'm not kidding. I have my best stories are true anecdotal stories. I'm on the soccer field, and one of my mom friends has this big binder. We're at the game. I'm like, what are you doing? She had a tab for every one of her son's classes because he was ineligible to play football. This is the most important thing, as it is to my son. And she had a tab where she was able to calculate exactly how many points he needed for each grade and how he could get those points. So he could be out. So, telling people that that's no longer an option, again, at the outset in your opening salvo, probably not the wisest thing.
Strong ideas here. really appreciate this. Another question from Helen Beatty, who's a leader in Up for Learning and one of our friends of the Research Collaborative. Just a lot of great work on student voice. She asks, have you tested proficiency-based, or did that term come up at all? Vermont has adapted proficiency-based. As you know, New Hampshire says mastery, Idaho says mastery. I have no idea what other states are, but everyone's doing. How about proficiency-based?
We didn't test proficiency-based, but when we did the digital media analysis, we looked for all three and considered them synonymous. So what we found, by and large, again, not surprisingly, that competency-based, including mastery and proficiency, were niche topics, very, very rarely used in social media. If it was mostly attached to higher ed, and it was mostly attached like when there was a conference or something on micro-credentials came up. That's when those terms were used. But personalized learning generally was used very widely in social media. But we didn't test that specific word. We only tested mastery versus competency.
Excellent. So a practical question. A district and a handful of principals are getting together to implement some new competency-based, proficiency-based, standards-based, mastery-based, whatever we're calling it, forms of instruction assessment in their school, and they have their one-pager built, and they're about to do an informational meeting with people in their community about that particular change that they want to move toward in this next year. What advice would you give them for what not to do and maybe what to do in that informational meeting? They already have the perfect one-pager. Now what do they do in that meeting that would help them start towards success?
Get ready for those questions that we know are going to follow, those ones I had on that early slide deck, again, that others have found that we all get. What does that mean? How is this going to look? How is the teacher going to, what's it going to change? That's when those questions come up, and that's when you can start answering those questions using some of the terms that didn't test that negative. You don't want to do it in your sales pitch. Maybe that's a better way to describe this rather than the one pager. It's your sales pitch. But again, what you want to sell them on is how you want the experience and the outcomes to be different for kids. Not on just, if not, then why are you doing it? Just to bring in laptops? Just to, mess with the schedule? Why are you doing it? Why do you think it needs to happen? Especially because we all know that if you look at the work and you talk to people who've done it, the people who push back the hardest, I should say the parent groups that push back the hardest, are the parents of the high achievers who don't want the system to change. Because they're the ones who know how to make the binder, to calculate the points, to make sure they get the right GPA. They're the ones who, know how to work the system. They were little Karla's mom and dad. They were little Karla's mom and dad. Yeah, they were my mom and dad. The system worked for me. So again, depending on the unique demographics of your district. In fact, one of my, again, favorite anecdotal stories, I was recently in a high school that was implementing competency-based diplomas based on Cambridge curriculum. They'd actually done an incredible job. They're like 2 or 3 years in. I was really impressed. They've got students taking the test and passing it. So I asked them if they were still giving traditional grades. They were, based on traditional measures. So then I had a student panel that they brought me. These were all kids that had passed the exam. If you know Cambridge, these are hard exams. These were the high flyers of the school, and I asked one of the girls, and she was young, like I'd say 9th or 10th grade, and she'd already passed the exam. So I said, do you still care about your grades? And she said, absolutely. And I said, why is that? She said, it's always been my dream to be the valedictorian and be ranked #1 in my class. So that's why you got to be prepared for those kids and parents out there who may not think that's a great idea. But again, you're not going to sell this as a way to get rid of valedictorians. You're going to sell this as a way of making sure that all students achieve mastery, that the diplomas are meaningful, that they're adequately prepared, that, you want to close the achievement gap, whatever it is you want to do, and that's why you think these changes are necessary. And it's going to take time. And also let the community know that this is going to be a long-term endeavor, and you're going to be communicating and working with them throughout the whole thing. This isn't something we're buying off the shelf that'll be implemented over a year.
We've also heard some pushback, just thinking about who knows how to work the system and who typically is, best served by traditional methods and traditional systems, who might have some reticence or express that reticence when we try to tweak the system in any sort of way. But we've also heard some pushback from underserved, marginalized, and minoritized communities that are concerned that this move could be taking away from their kids the clear back to basics approaches that they need in order to be successful in this economy, to learn the structures, the social capital, attain the social networks that they need in order to be successful in their community, and that this move strikes them as, and I'm using the words that I've heard, you know, on the ground, either too touchy-feely, not rigorous enough, leads them away from the clear, identifiable, straight pathway that gets them to a job and later. How would you respond to not those power players of the well-served students, but the students, parents of students who have not been as well-served to these to this change? How would you respond to that group?
I would remind them that the phrase that tested the best for us was knowledge and skills, knowledge and skills. So that knowledge, they get it. It was there. It was over and over and over again, regardless of demographics. Everybody knows that that's got to be there. But I think, and this is again my personal opinion, I think those other skills that we talk about, agency, voice, choice, all these other things, are in the how you're teaching the content, but making sure that you're still communicating that it's content, that the knowledge will still be taught. It's,
great.
I definitely agree.
Yeah. Another question from Helen. Are there any metaphors that you have discovered or would advocate that are effective to introduce personalized learning or mastery learning? Those really nice little phrases or metaphors.
Again, depending on the audience, our primary audience is policymakers. That's just who we are and what we do. I will tell you, and it's anecdotal, based on a lot of experience, and I have a slide that I'm happy to cut and paste and share out with you guys as soon as we get off the phone. The best talking point I've had, and it really also ties really well with what Nellie Mae found about the concern about remediation. Concern about remediation works well. So one of my taglines is that we believe the power of a mastery-based system is to correct the system of false signals and mixed messages we send when we give diplomas and credits based on grades and time spent in school. And then you can show the data. In fact, there was a really big article that came out just this past week. As you know, there's pushback in Maine to maybe even repeal their proficiency-based diploma. And I think it was the last sentence in that article. They pointed out the discrepancy between the graduation rate and the passage rate on ELA and math and the state test. That's a problem. You know, we can talk about increasing graduation rates being great, but if nothing is changing, and we can debate the merits of a one-time standardized test, I get that. But at some point, that can't be that disconnected. And so I have a slide that has these 3 really interesting data points, and they're surveys. And one of them says that I think it's 90% of parents think that their students are reading at grade level. Well, we know from NAEP that's not even remotely close to true, but they think they are. So to me, it's that important of what they think is happening, of how many students think they're prepared for college, how many A students in community college think they're prepared, but how they actually turn out. So it's that think they're prepared, because it's the false signals and mixed messages that we've been getting. Right. And when I do that slide, I'm not kidding. People take pictures, they tweet it out, I see heads shaking, I can see the light bulb go off. Because competency-based, no matter what you call it, quite frankly, is not the easiest thing to explain. It's just not. It's so different from what we've experienced. But when I use remediation and that mixed messages, it seems to begin to resonate. I can see a light bulb go off.
We're definitely getting some folks in the chat who want to see that slide. So great that you'll be willing to share that. I think we'd love to send that out as a postlude after this. One other question here. So many states are moving toward, and districts are moving toward spending a lot of time and a lot of resources and energy, well spent in my opinion, to define the profile of a graduate. In other words, what's the end game look like? What will the graduate of our K-12 system, what knowledge, skills, and dispositions will they possess, and how will that prepare them? Did you see any sort of connection, or did you test for this? And if not, that's fine. What would you suggest that correlated those that might have been working hard to define that end game and what that graduate would look like, and those who are more receptive to the terms that would get there? Did you notice that at all?
I would say from the districts that I've seen, the profiles I've seen, I think that if it's messaged well, I mean, you can do a profile of graduate, but you got to message it and distribute it well and be strategic, I think can help build that foundation for this shift. Because now here's the outcome, right? Here's the vision. And this is some of the things that we're going to do to try to get there, rather than making it sound, again, this is perception, making it sound like we're just changing school just to change school because we want to do fluffy stuff. But no, these are what we hear from our community of what we want our graduates to look like. It's a powerful message.
Great.
Adequately prepared with knowledge and skills.
Yeah, well-framed, well-messaged, and yeah, knowing which words play and which ones don't, with that huge caveat, no doubt.
Yeah. I want to touch on one thing that didn't come out in the data. Please. Technology, we specifically tested that word, and I have to be honest with you, I was shocked at how it didn't test really bad or really well. It just was there. I expected that one to be controversial, if nothing else, but it was kind of like a no big deal. However, there was an interesting, it was older voters were much more positively receptive to technology, the use of it in that sentence, than younger voters were.
Any supposition as to why that might be?
Oh, I absolutely do, based on my parents. And it's all based on anecdotal experience, right? No, seriously, because I think for us, I like to still think I'm still young, but technology is ubiquitous. We have it. It's everywhere. Our kids have it. That's not a big deal for us. That's why I don't think it tested high or low, because we didn't say kids would be spent, time would be spent in front of it all day. But for parents, like my dad, who is so excited to brag to his friends that he can use a laptop now, this is like a game changer. He's probably thinking, wow, every kid should be able to do this. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, they all can.
Yeah. Yeah. Welcome to the show. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, we only have a few minutes here, so I want to give you a minute if you'd like to just any final comments or opinions or any resources you'd like to highlight that that audience could go to get more information about this. Give you the final moment here, and then I'll wrap up.
Thanks. We have resources on that last slide. I will make sure that you and Melanie get a copy of the communications guide to distribute to all of your members in the collaborative as soon as it's produced in the next week or two. It's in final draft form. And look forward to feedback, because again, we're hoping to use that as a template for other audiences, primarily a broader public and policymaker view, which is where I'm really hoping to go deeper into that idea of remediation and preparation and meaningful diplomas and things like that. But feedback all along the way and what you're hearing, because I think it's powerful, because that's one of the main reasons we did this too, is this work is evolving at a rapid clip.
Yeah. Yeah. In a very noisy and complicated field. Yeah. Well, and we can't thank you enough for helping us to think through about the words that we're using, how we're communicating them, what we kind of tie our wagons to when we think about our messaging and our framing. Really helpful for us as a research collaborative and as a group of cross-sector leaders in the field to be thinking about those terms and our strategies moving forward. So very much appreciate that. We hope that you'll keep us in the loop too. If subsequent follow-up studies or you go deeper into some of these with later audiences and do similar studies, we'd like to know more about those and help amplify that and send it across our group. So please keep close. Want to thank, great. I want to thank Karla and her leadership in this and her fantastic presentation. Encourage those that attended today to check out more resources and share it with friends. Want to thank Melanie Mulvey, our program manager, for, as always, setting things up and helping them move smoothly. And then lastly, I want to thank all of the distinguished fellows on the line for attending and their great questions, and always the leadership in the field. And then lastly, I want to thank the Nellie Mae Education Foundation for their ongoing support for all of the work that we're doing in the Research Collaborative, and in particular the work that we do with our distinguished fellows and research teams to support this kind of field advancing effort. It looks like you have something you want to say, Karla?
One last, please let all of your collaborative members know we are trying to be very intentional in wide distribution, so we are willing to have these types of phone calls, private calls, come and do presentations to groups of schools, policymakers, whoever, any audience that you think would be receptive. We're willing to try to find a way to make sure that we can present to them.
Fantastic. There was a question about that in the chat, so I suspect you're going to be getting some emails after this very soon.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. See you soon.
Bye, Karla. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Karla. It was wonderful.